Thanks everybody for tuning in today. This is week 11 of our end of week webinar series. I want to acknowledge first off that we are on the sacred and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, especially the Suminas, Sinemuk, and Stanas First Nations. I'm really happy to welcome our guests today, Paul Manley, Member of Parliament, and Sheila Malcolmson, Member of the Legislative Assembly. This is a return visit for both of them. We started this weekly webinar series with Paul and then went to Sheila in our second week. So we're coming back now on week 11 to revisit some of those subjects that we first talked about and talk about the progress that we've made in BC and across the country since the pandemic started. There's a lot of stuff on my agenda today. We want to talk about the programs, the funding and support and assistance programs for businesses in Canada and in BC. We want to talk about I'm going to touch on the funding for municipalities, which was announced. With Sheila, I want to focus on specifically what the province is doing around a restart plan, WorkSafe, BC Hydro, ICBC, payment deferrals, the wood fiber announcement that was issued yesterday. And then we're going to turn around and talk about tourism a little bit. And we want to end off the conversation with some discussion around Black Lives Matter and the anti-racism movement as it stands today. So I want to start with you first, Paul, if you would, and talk about where we are with the program funding, what's new, what's old, what's going away, what's coming in. I want to talk a little bit about First Nations support as well. So do you want to take it from the top, sir?
Sure. Well, as people will know that the federal government has been rolling out programs since the early days of the lockdown with the pandemic, and these programs have changed incrementally as we found gaps in them. All the MPs from all parties, including the Liberals, have been pointing out issues that have been brought forward by their constituents, and so we've seen incremental changes on a lot of these programs, and there's still programs that are being rolled out. Of course, the changes to the CERB that were in Bill 17 that was proposed for this week didn't go through, as the same with the disability payments. There are new programs for Indigenous businesses, and originally the Indigenous businesses weren't being included in some of the existing programs, the CEBA and the wage subsidy, and it was based around the rules. And myself and Gord Johns and some other MPs really lobbied hard because there's different business models in our community. With Staminas, for example, has a business model that's very unique to that First Nation. And so we lobbied hard, and they changed the regulations around those back in May, and then they've put in additional support to provide for interest-free loans and additional funding to make sure that those businesses are captured in the COVID-19 response programs. The wage subsidy is right now it's available until August 29th, but I think that there's going to be an announcement soon that that's going to be extended. And the government really wants employers to use the wage subsidy to get people off the CERB and bring their employees back under. When we had our first seminar, Kim, we had Greg Phillips on, and he was talking about the layoff period and the problems with having employees laid off for too long. And so that's really what the wage subsidy is meant to do, is to bring employees back under that umbrella and get them off the CERB to ensure that they have their employees, and that they're not just relying on the CERB, which has some flaws to it, as we know. And the wage subsidy improved greatly since the last time we talked, so it's bumped up from that 10% to 75%. The CERB, as you know, has some issues with people coming, wanting to go back to work. And the main flaw that we've been advocating in that is that we need to have an incremental clawback on it. So it's similar to like a universal basic income. And in the experiment that they did in the pilot project they did in Ontario, there was a 50% wage clawback. So right now we've got a hard line. You earn $1,000, you earn 1,010, you're out. You know, you earn 999, you can still take that $2,000 CERB, and that's a problem. There's also the issue of people who never made that much money anyway. Like, so we have teenagers or people that were working part-time that were maybe making $1,000 a month and don't want to go back to work because now they're getting $2,000. And the intention I think that the government had with that is that some families where there would be a couple of working parents and maybe a teenager in the house that were all earning, in some cases, the money that the teenager was bringing in from the CERB was helping the family survive. But we have to figure out a way to get people to want to go back into the workforce. And I think having an incremental approach is far superior to having like hard lines and cutoffs on these things. One of the other aspects of Bill 17 that was problematic was just the threat of extreme fines and jail time. We already have laws against fraud in this country. So people who are involved in massive fraud around the CERB, and we've heard different stories about this, they will be, there's already parts of the criminal code that can deal with that situation and make sure that they're dealt with properly. People who make mistakes, and lots of people have made mistakes in their applications, shouldn't be punished for that. I mean, people are just trying to survive getting through this pandemic, and it's important that people, you know, don't get overly stressed out about it. And you hear stories about people who weren't sure whether they were eligible for it or not, and super nervous about even spending the money, but then realizing that they really had no choice if they wanted to pay their rent and keep food on the table. So there's things that need to change with the CERB, and we still need to get help for people with disabilities. In Bill C-17, the disability portion of it was tied to the disability tax credit. The problem is that only about 40% of people who actually get disability payments either through the province or through CPP disability, only about 40% of them actually receive that disability tax credit, because it's a bit of an onerous process to get through. And for people, you know, who have maybe cognitive disabilities or other disabilities, trying to do that paperwork themselves is problematic. There was just a news story on today about companies that do that then take 40% of that tax credit, which is, you know, just taking advantage of people who are already vulnerable in our communities. And so there are agencies like Community Living, and the Nanaimo Association of Community Living would be able to help people get through that process. But I've worked with people with disabilities, and I know that it's onerous and difficult to get on disability to begin with, and to deal with those tax credits and deal with all this paperwork is problematic. So we need a better way to ensure that people who need that help get that help, and soon. The business account, I got the figures here for how many people have used that now and how much is available, because you wanted to know about that. So it's a total investment of $55 billion. As of June 10th, there was 663,000 loans that have been issued, and that represents $26 billion. So this program had changed as well. It was there was a lot of problems flagged around this. You know, with the limit for $40,000 you had to have earned, and in the time period that people had to earn it. So there's been a lot more flexibility built into that, and so it's open for businesses that paid up to $1.5 million in payroll, and businesses that had less than $20,000 in payroll can access it. And they have just have to have filed taxes in 2018 or 2019, and they have to attest that to having non-deferrable expenses between $40,000 and 1.5 million, subject to verification and audit. So that still hasn't rolled out, and I'm hearing from a lot of people wondering when that's going to happen. It should be rolled out any time now. I was told 2 weeks ago that 2 weeks from now it would be ready. So I'm hoping that that's ready to go next week. Yeah, so just a little bit of, I'm just going by your guidelines here, Kim, a little bit on what happened in this week in Ottawa. And, you know, we're trying to figure out kind of where we go from here. I know we want to get Parliament back to normal. And there's been some noise about this by different parties, but, you know, basically we all want to get back to the business of government. And I know the Liberals have a legislative agenda that they want to get moving through as well. Right now, we're still working through the technology and the translation and everything else. I was in a industry committee meeting yesterday that had to be adjourned because the technology wasn't working and the translation wasn't happening properly. So out of 23 standing committees, we have 7 operating. There's 4 other special committees of the House of Commons, so 27 committees in total, and we only have 7 of them going, based on what we have access for with technology. We're working on a voting system, which should be fairly straightforward because it isn't a secret ballot. So it's not like a federal election or a provincial election. Everybody's going to know how I vote as an MP. So we just have to have a way to go through that roll call to be able to vote on legislation. And then it's just figuring out who is in the House and who's there virtually. And we need to make sure that there's representation across the country, and that right now it's easy for MPs in the Ottawa area or Montreal or Southern Ontario to get to Ottawa. But for me to get to Ottawa, it's a 2-day journey now. There's one flight out of Nanaimo, and I catch a 5 o'clock flight out of Nanaimo, and it's a red eye. 6 hours in the air. I get into Ottawa at 10 a.m. the next day and spend 10 hours hanging out in airports overnight. Not a lot of fun. Not like really living the dream. So we have to figure out a way to get things back to normal, and there's been a real push by the official opposition to do that. And I don't disagree with it. We need to get to the business of the country, and we need to deal with the budget and supplementary estimates and all of those kind of details. I've been pushing for funding for municipalities since early April because people were emailing me saying, how am I going to pay my property taxes? Small businesses were contacting me about this as well. And you could just see the writing on the wall. Like, municipalities are going to be hard hit by this. They're closing facilities that they rely on for revenue. They're laying off employees. Transit use was way down. So the hit on transit was estimated around $400 million across the country. And the losses to municipalities were in the billions. And they were asking, I think Canadian Federation of Municipalities was asking for in the range of $12 billion. And what the federal government has done right now is put in money for the infrastructure, the gas tax infrastructure funding, and they've allocated next year's funding to this year. So they're providing more funding, but that's in the $2 billion range. It's well short of what's being asked for, but the federal government continues to defer to the provinces on this. And I think that's kind of problematic in a way because we're all in this together, and the federal government is the main tax collector in the country. And we have to make sure that the municipalities aren't hit by a whole bunch of tax defaults, property tax defaults by businesses and homeowners who are struggling. So more needs to be done on that. And we keep on pushing, all the different parties keep on pushing on that, including within the Liberal Party. So then the last thing here, the rent relief, rent assistance program. There's been some changes with that. Initially, right off the mark, there was some things that were flagged, and having the landlords having to have a mortgage and the money going straight to the mortgage holder was flagged as problematic. There's still problems with this program. The landlord having to be responsible for attestations by their tenants, and being responsible, if their tenants aren't fully honest about what their financial situation is, and putting the landlord on the hook for that, that's a problem. So there's a number of things with this that need to be fixed, and I was really happy to see that the province had stepped up to make sure that landlords can't evict their tenants, and that it pushes landlords to get into this program, but there's still some issues with it.
That's the one that we hear most about from small businesses, is the confusion around the commercial rent program. I'll just comment on wage subsidy. We applied for it, and it was a fairly rigorous application. It was difficult and challenging, and I wasn't sure if we were doing it right. But we found out within 3 days that we were approved for the wage subsidy. I was very pleased about that, of course, because it allows us to keep fully staffed during these times. And so we assumed that once we were approved for the first payments, that subsequent payments would be approved, and that we had done everything right and completed the application correctly. We're in a fortunate position where we don't pay rent. We own our building. But so many businesses in town do pay rent, and we were getting a lot of calls around the end of April, beginning of May. They've tapered off quite a bit now, but I think part of that is the bold step that the province took. Maybe you could start by addressing that, what Finance Minister James came out with in her announcement a couple of weeks ago, Sheila.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And really glad that the Chamber staff team has been able to continue in full force. You're really leading the forward thinking in the community about how to come out on the other side of this better than we are right now. You've had some real wins with City Council, and bringing us together in this way, as you've been doing at least once a week, I'm sure is making sure that our community stays together in a cohesive way, and has certainly combated some of our, I'm sure Paul and I both are missing the adrenaline and the human contact that comes with our work. It's astonishing. Like, we get a lot done in a day, but it's because we're kind of fueled by people power. It's very strange to do that just on the computer, but both the Chamber and VIEA have done a really nice job of keeping us connected and keeping us learning, which we really are all hungry for. So it's been 2 months since I last sat with you and your membership in this way. And I'm just going to talk about just the things that have happened in just the last 2 weeks, because the pace is extreme. New programs being added and amended all the time. But I will start with the federal commercial rent program, which the province partners on, but we don't have control of the reins the way that we did, for example, with our residential tenant protection. So just a reminder on that one, we're the only jurisdiction in North America that offered rent support for residential tenants. We didn't want anybody to lose their home as a result of COVID-19. And it is a tenant-led program. The funding, the money goes to the landlord, so that it gives landlord stability, but it is the tenant that has kind of control of the reins as to whether they apply for that. And that's not the case with this federal commercial rent program. It's something that we fought for as a province, because we're partnering on the program. We had at least the ability to lobby the feds about how the program was designed. We lobbied quite hard for it to be tenant-led. We didn't win that. We did lobby hard also to have the mortgage rule removed, and we're very glad to have seen that change. So that did make a big difference. But our remedy for not having one on it being tenant-led was to make it, to add this policy, which just came maybe 10 days ago, I think. Again, this is a Carol James policy, protecting businesses from evictions if, so this is an emergency order. Landlords who would have been eligible for the commercial rent subsidy but chose not to apply for it, they are no longer allowed to evict their tenants. So we're hoping that this is going to encourage more landlords to apply for the program, and it will also give some temporary relief to businesses who have been hardest hit by the pandemic. I really would love to hear from businesses whether this is working, because applications only just opened a couple of weeks ago. I understand that the experience of the program is still limited, but as for most everything else, we can try to modify stuff if it's not working. So do let me know. I'll just run through a couple more, just a handful of actions that we've taken just in the last couple of weeks. More than 150,000 students returned to school just on that first day of school. That was an optional return to school. We've got new online resource that's been launched showcasing job vacancies in agriculture, really hoping with fewer temporary foreign workers being able to come in, but also more people looking for jobs, that we might be able to do a bit of a matching service. That's been particularly hoped for in the seafood and food processing sector, as well as farmers. And it's kind of a one-stop shop that we hope is going to be a win-win for both job seekers and employers. Amplify BC, through Creative BC, we just dropped $7.5 million to help the music industry to create and operate during the pandemic. Extremely hard hit, and that's not going to let up. I mean, ordinary operations are not going to let up in the foreseeable future. An additional $250,000 to support industry-led Buy BC activities, focusing on e-commerce. So that's a doubling of the funding that had previously been announced. We've also given temporary relief to hospitality licensees who have had to suspend operations as a result of COVID-19, as licensees are allowed to sell their existing liquor stock to other licensees who are still operating, and also to private liquor stores. And that follows on the patio fast track. There's been quite a few liquor amendments that have come out of Minister Eby's office. Anybody that's got a particular interest in that area, let me know. I've been trying to keep folks updated as these things come in, but let me know. BC farmers and processors moving online have got an additional $250,000. And maybe that's the end of the list for just right now. Probably the federal rent eviction ban has probably been the thing that probably would relate to your members the most in that last 2-week reporting period. Yeah. And maybe I'll just say big picture, Kim, just really recognize that, that the BC public has given more through this pandemic than we asked them to. People have been extremely trusting of the civil service leadership, the provincial health officers' orders, and just been an extraordinary amount of trust and buy-in, which is a deep honor and of course huge responsibility. And we recognize that particularly a community like Nanaimo, with our reliance on retail, service, and tourism, that the economic cost of people adhering so cooperatively and in such a community-minded way on the health side and protecting elders. And thankfully, Vancouver Island has really ducked the worst. I mean, the feeling of dread in the beginning of March about how bad this could be for us was extreme and really rattled everybody. That we've ducked, touch wood, the worst of those health outcomes means, you know, we really recognize the grief and the damage caused by the measures themselves. And I don't know that it could have been any other way. And we certainly see, looking at Washington and Oregon's numbers right now, are out of control. California, all these jurisdictions just immediately to the south of us are peaking again. So we're not complacent about how important it is to keep that border closed. Paul and I need to keep advocating for that, as we have. I know Vancouver Island, I worked really hard to cancel the Washington State ferries, the 3 ferries that were landing on Vancouver Island, arguably the single point of greatest risk for us on Vancouver Island. And Island Health asked me to do that, and I'm so glad that we got that done. But we've got a lot of heavy lifting ahead of us. And so I'm especially grateful to the businesses that are hanging in there and the business organizations like the Chamber that are leading the charge as we build back better. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Sheila. We have a number of questions that come in regarding still more federal relief for municipalities. Municipalities have, Nanaimo has extended your property tax deadline into the fall, which will cause cash flow issues for the municipal government. You have to remember that they are receiving no revenue from their facilities. Swimming pools, rinks are closed, but more importantly, the Port Theatre has been closed since March. The Port Theatre provides a great deal of revenue to the city of Nanaimo, helping to offset expenses, as well as the Vancouver Island Conference Centre. And with travel and tourism down, hotels are shuttered for the most part. This has caused, a decline in traffic, and so that has an impact on the city as they lose their revenues from parking, which we don't think about all the time. But there's a tremendous amount of money that's involved in parking in downtown Nanaimo, especially, and that's just not happening anymore. So, working hard to bring business back to downtown as well as the rest of the community. But I think, Paul, if you can lean on anybody in Ottawa and Sheila in Victoria to really bring up the profile of the discussion around municipalities and how we're going to make it through this over the long term. We had a question. I want to remind everybody who's watching, just go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there and ask any questions you like. I do have a question from a member here about extending commercial rent assistance and the wage subsidy program, because some organizations are going to have to deal with a longer recovery than others. And this company is in the hospitality industry, and there's probably not been a sector that has been as hard hit as hospitality and tourism. I know that we're going to be focusing, or Tourism Vancouver Island, Tourism Nanaimo, and the rest of the DMOs around the province are going to be focusing on domestic and local traffic and promoting staycations. A couple of comments on that. And I mean, this all, again, that ties into the argument about border openings and border closings. And certainly, I don't think anybody in BC is too excited to see the US-Canadian border open anytime soon. But there's also a kind of a mental border between provinces that also exists. Speaking to my colleagues in the Kootenays and Eastern BC, they have a real issue because their biggest source of customers is Alberta. And Albertans aren't comfortable coming to British Columbia, and they're not being made to feel welcome in a number of cases because they are coming from Alberta, which might only be, down the road, across the street sort of thing. So comment on that, please. Let's start with you, Sheila.
Yeah, no question. We want to keep the US border closed. The Washington State transmission rate is 22% that of British Columbia's. And it's actually really interesting, the firefighters union was at the legislature just the week before the global pandemic the week that the global pandemic was declared. And they were giving some early warning, telling me about the impacts on Washington firefighters. They'd walked into one of those old age homes and ended up, as a result, because not knowing what they were walking into, but also not having the kind of isolation of separate platoons of firefighters. 22 firefighters were in isolation by the end of the day as a result of that one health call. So they, we know the differential. And people that have said, why isn't BC as good as New Zealand or Australia? It's like, come on, we've got the most, at that point, the most out of control infections in the world were in the States and right on the other side of our border. So really glad that we were able to keep it closed. And I agree with you, as important as trading partners and friends as the Americans are, I hear from a lot of people that they are much more comfortable keeping it closed. On the tourism side, $10 million has been sort of the first step on community destination marketing. I hear the Premier speak about tourism. It's kind of like he's really sort of taking the lead on that in his weekly press availabilities. I think that at the end of this second isolation period, the second incubation period following the beginning of stage 2 of the restart, Dr. Bonnie Henry says, we're going to be able to have some more clear messages about the timing of opening up tourism provincially and encouraging people to start to travel for non-essential purposes again within our boundaries, our provincial boundaries. Maybe even next week we might start to hear some encouraging messages. But I have been hearing absolutely from tourism operators saying, we're trying to make the decision about whether to open this year at all. And we really need to know right now. But just unfortunately, we haven't had the health data. And we don't want to move into the next phase and then have to retreat as some other jurisdictions have. So we've got altogether, we've allocated $1.5 billion for economic recovery. Tourism is going to be a major part of that, and they're on the task force that's doing some of the work about what things look like on the other side. The authorizing the expansion of service areas, patios, some of those kind of small steps, I think have been sending us in the right direction. And I think you're going to see Destination BC right now is working on an inter-provincial marketing campaign. And I think you'll see it rolled out in quite a dramatic and beautiful way as soon as the PHO says that that we're good to go. And I just love hearing the Premier say, anywhere you are in BC is beautiful, stay there right now. And then this summer, get ready to go and visit the communities that are willing to receive you. Haida Gwaii, Stand Up Haida Nation is a very good example of some places that will say, our elders are too precious, we don't want you to come this year. But others like Tofino, we can see are really getting ready under their own terms and conditions to welcome people back. And I hope we can have a really strong summer of spending in the local economy, getting outdoors, doing that with our families, and then being prepared. It may well be that we are operating more conservatively again come the fall. So I hope people will really take this summer and take the opportunity of good weather outdoors to get out and explore and spend if and when they can. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that there isn't a fixed date for phase 3 of the recovery plan, and that's going to be up to decision-making on behalf of Dr. Bonnie and the Premier and the Health Minister.
She's been talking about this quite a bit and saying she's hoping mid-June, beginning of July would be entering the second phase if our numbers continue to hold as well as they have. So I would imagine that we'll get an update from her on that next week, but she talks about it almost every day. If we keep on this track, then we are soon going to be able to enter phase 3.
Yeah, be excited about that for sure. Before we run out of time, I wanted to pivot and talk about Black Lives Matter. We've seen demonstrations and protests in the past about racism, anti-racism, but this one seems a whole lot different. For one thing, it's ignited passion around the world with huge demonstrations in Europe and Australia. In Canada as well, there was a large gathering at Matteo Sutton Park. Was it last Friday or the Friday before, which was very interesting to see the numbers of people down there, all appropriately masked and distancing themselves. But there was an editorial or an op-ed in the Nanaimo News Bulletin this week written by good friend and city councillor George Anderson. And he opened by saying, too often in Canada, we parade our moral superiority by comparing ourselves with the USA, which is problematic. It creates a tendency to minimize or forget about the deep-rooted issues here at home. The reality is racism, prejudice, and inequality are alive in Canada. Paul, do you want to comment on George's statement?
Sure. Well, I've known George since he was pretty young, and I know that he experienced, racism and being pulled over, for driving while black. And we have a history in this country that includes slavery. We have a police force that was created to enforce the Indian Act. And if you want to see what systemic racism looks like, read the Indian Act. It is a racist document, and we have a long history in this country of exclusions, of head taxes, of property confiscation, and keeping visible minorities down. And our police forces have been complicit in this. The carding in Toronto, we have a lot of policing of marginalized people, whether that's visible minorities or people living in poverty. And there's a push now to see some of those police resources put back into things that the police shouldn't be doing. So, wellness checks, working with people with mental health or addiction issues on the street. Those are not jobs that the police have been trained for. My sister was a police officer for 25 years with the OPP. She's Indigenous. She's from the Haisla Nation. We had an open adoption as kids, so I was adopted by her family, and I have a family in the Haisla Nation. And my sister was at the front line of the Ipperwash inquiry. She was at the front line of the Caledonia conflict with the Six Nations Mohawks. She was an Aboriginal liaison, part of the Aboriginal relations team of the OPP. She dealt with racism within that force, sexism within that force for a long time. And she was a use of force trainer and a cultural competency trainer. And one of the things that she would tell me over and over again is that the police do not vet their applicants well enough. There are people that go into the police forces that are well-meaning, that are fully functional and able to do that job properly and there for the right reasons. But there are people that end up in those police forces that have no business at all being police officers. And seeing that from a perspective of being within a police force, we have called for a better vetting process in Canada. We know that the FBI had identified in the United States that the white supremacist movements were actually getting people to join police forces and to integrate into police and military forces. And we've seen in the Canadian military that some of the people in our Canadian military had been involved in white supremacist organizations. And we need to make sure that we root out anybody that's involved in that in our policing. And so we actually really need a different approach to policing. When my sister was doing frontline work, she didn't wear a uniform, she didn't have a gun. And I brought this up in the House of Commons. There's a Kwantlen Dun First Nation in the Yukon has a different approach to community safety officers. So these are people that aren't wearing uniforms, they don't have weapons, and they're there to work on the issues that are coming up in the community, because that community had a lot of problems with the RCMP and wanted a different approach. And I think that model of community safety officers needs to be spread out across the country, and we need to reallocate resources so the police aren't dealing with mental health and addiction issues. They're there for the things that we really need a police officer there for, but we deal with these other social problems as the social and health problems that they are.
Councillor Martman points out that there is another march for Black Lives Matter on Saturday at 2 p.m. going from the Fayose Sutton Park to the courthouse. And she also points out this is the time for us to have uncomfortable conversations, to listen and make changes. And I think what you're bringing up about the police, and Police Superintendent Miller was our guest last Friday, and he spoke about the challenges in recruiting currently. Sheila, do you want to reflect on some of this too?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, to your question, Kim, no doubt we have a racist history in British Columbia. Nanaimo knows that well. Whether your family is Asian or Indigenous, that's at the structure of this this form of our city, this chapter of our city. I like to think we've moved beyond that, and things are certainly better than they were 25 years ago. I first got into elected office because of the things I heard in our community halls about the belief of what would happen to our community if there was a treaty settlement and Nanaimo took back the land. And I'm hearing actually everybody in leadership say, yeah, this is, we are activated by the death of George Floyd, but we're not just pointing our fingers at the states. We've got a lot of work to do. Hey, and Zenny's speech at the rally last week was fantastic. I loved hearing that allyship, especially spoken from a position of motherhood. But I think there's two conversations myself happening simultaneously. I mean, we know well, Kim, we've spent a lot of time talking about social disorder in Nanaimo and getting more and different kinds of resources to police. Nobody's written to me asking that our police be defunded, but we talk all the time about how we can get the download of deinstitutionalization and the epidemic of addictions and growing mental health. Partly as we remove the stigma around talking about mental health, we're more aware of it. But there's no question police are being asked to do work that takes them away from the actual job of crime fighting. There are some really great examples out there that sometimes the news doesn't pick up the good news, but in our twice weekly, or when the legislature's sitting 3 times a day, our caucus meets sometimes. And I hear our ministers talk all the time about the models that are out there. A couple of police forces that have psychiatric nurses on a sort of ride along with certain kinds of calls with police, which is fantastic. You have people that are able to de-escalate and there's no force necessary. Death of Chantel Moore, to have a welfare check end in a police shooting, how can that happen? And of course, that's hit our community on Vancouver Island very hard. There's also a program called the Abbotsford Angels. I think there's angels in the name, where a peer-led support group, people with lived experience of street entrenchment and addiction and surviving mental health challenges, are working with police, again, in the certain kinds of calls. The dispatcher will say, this is when we need this team. So we've got models like that. Just last night, Mike Farnworth, who's our Solicitor General, announced that he's one of the first things that we'll do when the legislature reconvenes in 2 weeks, 10 days, is strike a committee to review the Police Act. Who knew that it was 45 years old? We've got so much to do as a government, and there's so much ground to make up for us as a province, especially on restoring and repairing the social safety net. I was not aware that updating the Police Act, was so overdue. So we've got a lot of experience in 45 years, and that's going to be a public process. A committee will be struck, and that will include the mental health focus as well as the systemic racism focus. Thanks.
Interesting. 45 years old. That's pretty incredible. Without a review, and wow, how much has changed in 45 years? That's remarkable.
Never's been a political priority, and so that's to the credit to local people that are really ringing the alarm on this, that now this is a political priority. We've got tools. every day in a minority government, every day you're like, okay, what can we lock in that will last? Because we don't know how long we're going to have the honor of leading government. So this is another piece that we can act quickly on. And maybe, Kim, I'll just say just a couple things about reopening the legislature. That's going to start on the 22nd of June. I've got one of the very first speeches that was scheduled 3.5 months ago. We are the only, another point of pride for BC, we're the only jurisdiction in Canada that is going to a full parliament legislature, using all of the rules of debate and question period and voting and everything. That'll be a mix of in-person and virtual. Our plan has been signed off by Bonnie Henry. There will be, I don't know if people have watched this online, but you can watch on one screen the legislature, the more ordinary debate, and then in another room, or sometimes 3 other rooms, there are debates on the budget happening simultaneously. So we're going to be doing that too. You will be able to see some days 3 different ministers standing up and defending their budgets, and see the back and forth. So that will happen Thursdays and Fridays, virtually only, up to 3 debates happening simultaneously. And then Monday to Wednesday, a full question period, member statements, debate on legislation, and it'll be a mix of in-person and online, including voting, so that we adhere to the physical distancing that is necessary, and then also get on with doing the work of government. And big thanks to both the Liberals and the Greens for supporting this work this last 3 months. The amount of buy-in and cooperation and a very constructive and cooperative tone has been greatly appreciated. It's got a lot to do with BC's success, and it kind of busts the stereotype of BC politics, let alone minority government politics. So I'm really grateful for that too.
That's great news to hear that, and I think it's a great symbol of the new normal as well. To see politicians get along and not be there simply to oppose or to lead, on an issue. I have one final question that's come in from a colleague in the community, and an opportunity for both of you to answer. Is there a need for Nanaimo to have a list of shovel-ready projects available for when stimulus dollars become available? Something that we can send to both the province and the feds. And a quick answer from each of you before we wind down here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's something that the RDN and City of Nanaimo are working on all the time. And so in any scenario, I mean, we're spending tons of infrastructure money right now, both federally and provincially. So we are always looking to those local governments, and then we get behind them and push. And so, yeah, there's a long wish list, and the strategic planning that both those local governments have done is what informs that wish list of infrastructure needs.
Paul?
Yeah, and I would say the same, that I've encouraged local municipalities to look at what they want to do in terms of stimulus. And there's 3 things that they need to consider in terms of stimulus. And one is maximum number of jobs per dollar, so that we can get people employed. We're also in a climate crisis, so we want to ensure that we're working on that crisis as well, and planning for how we're going to be a more resilient community, more resilient region, and more resilient country, because that hasn't changed. We're in a pandemic right now, but the climate change is still an issue. May was the warmest May on record, as long as they've been taking temperatures. And we're lucky right now, it's raining a lot. We're not heading towards a fire season, but we've already seen flooding in other places in Canada. We're looking at fire seasons in other places in Canada. So a climate lens, and then also a reconciliation lens, to make sure that what we're doing as communities, we're working with the local First Nations to work on projects together and ensure that we're moving forward on the reconciliation agenda. So those kind of projects, shovel-ready projects for infrastructure, are really important to have ready to go.
Thanks for touching on the reconciliation subject. I want to mention that the Chamber of Commerce's virtual annual general meeting is being held next Wednesday at 12 noon. I urge everybody who has an interest in what we've been doing for the past year to check that out, register, and if you're a member, of course, you're given voting instructions, and we'll be reviewing our financials for last year. Most importantly, though, what we will be doing is welcoming a guest speaker, Carol Ann Hilton, who came to Nanaimo to speak in January, will be speaking. Carol Ann is the CEO of the Indigenomics Institute of Canada, very prominent First Nations woman with incredible expertise and knowledge about the Indigenous economy. Erilyn Thomas will be introducing Carol Ann, and Sheila will be providing the thank yous at the end of that. Our AGMs go very quickly, and so we anticipate a half an hour spent in the AGM part of it, and then another half an hour speaking with Erilyn, Sheila, and Carol Ann. That's next Wednesday, the 17th. Then next Friday, the 19th, I'm looking forward to welcoming some of our friends and neighbors from Nanaimo First Nations and the rest of the Indigenous community locally to talk about First Nations and Indigenous issues and the racism that unfortunately has accompanied much of, or a lot of what we've done in our history with First Nations. And I'm doing it next Friday as a salute to the fact that Saturday is National Aboriginal Day, which we celebrate here. I've been happy to volunteer. I understand it will be a virtual celebration this year, so I won't have to go farther than my computer to volunteer this year. I look forward to being part of it. I can't announce right now who will be my guest next Friday, and I'm still waiting on confirmations from 2 or 3 people. So we'll see how that unfolds. But we've gone past our 50-minute mark now. I want to thank you both, Paul and Sheila, for being our guests today. Great conversation. I know that this could go on much longer, but thank you both very much. Have a great weekend, and thank you everybody for tuning in and viewing. This is also available as a recording afterwards on the Chamber of Commerce website, or on Facebook, and on our YouTube channel. So you can check it out and share it there. Thank you for those who have been providing the questions for us today. And we'll see you, if not Wednesday, hopefully next Friday. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.